Hello again. It's me, Clyde. I'm so glad you've joined me. Whether it's your first time tagging along on one of these wonderfully uneventful adventures, or you've been dozing your way through them all with me from the start. If you haven't already, there's a playlist called Clyde's Boring Adventures in History. That's where you'll find the whole collection. Stories of slow walks through time, of rain on rooftops, dusty windowsills, and conversations that gently wander off track. You can pop one on anytime you like. They're there for you, whenever you need a soft landing. Before we begin, this would be the perfect moment to tap that like button, and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. That way, the next time your eyes get heavy and your thoughts feel far away, you'll have something new waiting. And if you'd like to support the channel and help keep these sleepy journeys going, consider becoming a channel member. It means a lot. And for those who do, I'll craft a personalized sleepy story just for you. Something quiet. Something just for your ears. All right then. Tonight's story starts with the sound of a teacup. Not a clink or a crash. Nothing dramatic like that. Just the soft kiss of porcelain meeting wood and the faint curl of steam rising from a cup that might have sat a little too long. I didn't mean to meet Leonardo da Vinci. Truly, I was just wandering. That happens a lot. Time doesn't always give me much of a heads up. One minute I'm standing in a quiet grove with my hand on that odd little stone I found ages ago, and the next I'm blinking in the sunlight of some other century. This time I landed in a courtyard that smelled like rosemary and old parchment. There was a cat sleeping under a fig tree, a fountain making polite conversation with itself, and a rather worn-looking kettle resting near the edge of a wide table. The table was set for two, which was a surprise. I hadn't brought anyone with me, and the cat didn't seem the type to entertain. But then I heard the scraping of a stool from behind a curtain, and a man, tallish, a bit smudged with ink, shuffled into the light carrying a bundle of what appeared to be feathers, string, and several spoons tied together with twine. He nodded once, muttered something about steam pressure and bird bones, and sat down across from me. That was my first moment with Leonardo da Vinci. We didn't start with grand ideas. There were no speeches about the future or clever remarks about invention. Mostly, he poured the tea, sniffed it like it might reveal a secret, and stirred it with a twig that may or may not have been a paintbrush. It wasn't exactly the Renaissance I'd imagined, but it was comfortable. The sunlight filtered through some grapevines overhead, drawing sleepy lines on the tabletop. The wind smelled of ink and wildflowers. And Leonardo, it turned out, was only slightly distracted, which for him I think was pretty focused. He asked me if I believed birds dream in color. I said I wasn't sure, but I hoped they did. He nodded solemnly, and then began tying another spoon to what I later learned was a prototype for a mechanical owl. And that's how it went. One moment to the next, not really going anywhere, but certainly arriving. Anyway, you don't need to follow too closely. You're welcome to drift off whenever your eyes feel ready. I'll still be here, mumbling about tea leaves and wingspans and the proper ratio of honey to hot water. It's not a thrilling tale, but it's ours for tonight. Shall we begin? The tea was warmish. Not too hot, not too cold. The kind of temperature that feels like it's been waiting a little too long, but doesn't mind. Leonardo swirled his cup a few times, watching the tiny vortex he made, as if it were a portal to another dimension, which, knowing him, he may have truly believed. He didn't sip right away. Instead, he pulled from his robe's inside pocket a scrap of parchment and flattened it with 2 fingers. Ink-stained, of course. It was covered in uneven lines, a kind of architectural doodle that looked like a bridge and a bird had been smushed together in a dream. He asked if I'd ever tried flying. I told him only once. From a small hill, using what turned out to be a clothesline and too much optimism, it ended with a skinned knee and a newfound respect for gravity. Leonardo made a low humming sound. Not disapproving, just noting it. Then he stuck a pencil behind his ear and used a second one from some hidden pocket I couldn't see to make a quick adjustment to the sketch. I think he added more feathers. He said feathers made everything better. I wasn't sure if he meant it metaphorically or literally. Behind him, the curtain he'd emerged from earlier rustled with the softest of breezes. Beyond it, I could hear the occasional clatter. Something fell over and something else rolled. The sounds of a mind that never quite came to rest. Still, he didn't seem in a hurry, and neither was I. I looked around the courtyard. The cat, ginger-furred and expertly uninterested, had shifted to lie in a slightly warmer patch of sun. Its tail twitched once. The fig tree offered shade that danced gently with the wind, casting leaf-shaped shadows that flickered like old film. Somewhere up high, a pigeon cooed. Leonardo finally sipped his tea. Then very softly he said, "I think I made this kettle to whistle, but I forgot to give it a voice." He looked genuinely perplexed by this realization, as though the kettle had failed him on some fundamental level. I suggested that perhaps it was shy. He blinked at me, smiled a little, and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is a shy kettle." Then he reached over and patted it, not adjusted it, or examined it, or rebuilt it entirely, as I expected. Just a small, reassuring pat. The kettle, to its credit, didn't seem to mind. We sat there for a while after that, saying nothing. The kind of silence that has shape to it, like the pause in a song or the space between breaths. Leonardo was drawing again, idly sketching a teacup with wings. I rested my elbows on the table and let my head tilt slightly. The warmth of the sun had found the top of my shoulder. I closed my eyes. It was one of those rare moments where I wasn't thinking about time travel or where or when I'd end up next. I was just here, with the steam curling gently from the kettle and the paper rustling, and the cat snoring in the background like a very small, satisfied dragon, and Leonardo mumbling to himself about steam pressure and wing angles like a man perfectly content in his own daydream. A pigeon landed on the edge of the fountain, took one look at us, and flew away again. Wise choice, I thought. Too much genius at one table could make a bird nervous, though truth be told, only one of us was responsible for the genius, and it wasn't me. Leonardo da Vinci's left shoe was untied. I only mention it because he seemed entirely unaware. And it wasn't just untied, it was barely on. Every few minutes it would make a soft flap sound when he shifted his feet beneath the table, like a tired bird flapping once to remind you it's still there. I thought about telling him, but I got distracted watching a line of ants marching along the edge of the courtyard wall. They were very focused on something. I never figured out what. Leonardo was sketching again. This time he'd abandoned the flying teacup and had moved on to a series of spirals, long, delicate loops that reminded me of fiddlehead ferns and the shells you sometimes find washed up on beaches in forgotten corners of the world. "Everything has a spiral," he said, apropos of nothing. "Even sleep," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that made sense. He nodded like it did. Then he stared at the kettle for a while. Not in a worrying way, more like someone trying to remember whether or not they'd invented a new kind of hinge that morning. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, or maybe that was just the fig leaves rustling above us again. The cat had rolled onto its back. Its paws were in the air, perfectly still, as if it had been frozen mid-dream. Occasionally one ear would twitch. Otherwise, it looked like a sun-warmed loaf of bread that someone had forgotten to slice. Leonardo suddenly stood, He didn't say a word, just rose from his seat, shuffled across the courtyard in his loose, flap-footed way, and disappeared behind the curtain. There was a brief clatter, then a thunk, then silence. I sipped my tea again. It had cooled almost completely, but it still had a sort of gentle sweetness to it, like it remembered the heat. A minute later, Leonardo returned, holding what appeared to be a spoon with wings. It was made of wood and something that may have once been part of a parasol. He placed it carefully on the table, gave it a look of deep satisfaction, then sat back down and resumed his spirals. "I think it's a message delivery spoon," he explained very seriously. I asked who it would deliver to. He shrugged. "Anyone who needs tea." It was hard to argue with that logic. Another breeze wandered through the courtyard. This one smelled faintly of citrus and chimney soot. I don't know how it managed both, but there it was. The scent curled around my shoulders like a soft shawl. Leonardo looked at me then, really looked, and asked, "Do you ever miss the present?" I tilted my head. "I suppose I do. But sometimes, when I'm there, I miss everything else." He smiled faintly, as if I'd passed some quiet test he hadn't told me about. Then he pointed a long finger at the ants on the wall. "They're always in the present," he said. "No past, no future, just now." I watched them again. They did look awfully busy. Leonardo went back to drawing spirals. I went back to thinking about absolutely nothing, and the left shoe kept flapping. Leonardo's lecture on grapevines started, as many of his thoughts did, without warning. He had paused mid-spiral, looked up at the leaves overhead, and frowned slightly. Not in displeasure, but the kind of contemplative wrinkle that says something is brewing. He leaned back in his chair and began tracing a single vine with his eyes. His finger moved slightly in the air, mimicking the curl of the plant as it reached along the pergola's beam, curling in that lazy spiral vines always seemed to favor. He didn't even look at me when he said, "You know they reach, not because they're going anywhere, but because they remember sunlight." I blinked. Leonardo blinked back. Then he took a sip of tea that had likely gone tepid 20 minutes ago, made a face, and muttered something about thermal retention ratios and ceramic density. He stood again, the flap of his left shoe still echoing quietly with every other step, and wandered over to the vine-covered post. There, he began to gesture. Not frantically. Nothing about Leonardo was ever frantic, but with a kind of deliberate patience. He waved one hand toward a bundle of leaves, then used the other to draw invisible lines from branch to branch, like a conductor of some long-forgotten botanical symphony. "The growth is not chaotic," he said, half to me and half to the fig tree. "It looks unruly, but it obeys laws. Laws I've not fully found yet. But they are there, just humming beneath the bark." He tapped the wooden post once. It did not hum. Still, I nodded. Because honestly, who was I to argue with someone who had very likely designed half the courtyard I was sitting in his sleep? Back at the table, the kettle gave a small tick sound as it cooled. The cat stretched, yawned a tiny roar, and flopped onto its side with the grace of a pillow tossed lazily on a couch. Leonardo returned a moment later, this time with a pair of pruning shears he'd retrieved from somewhere behind the curtain. He snipped a bit of vine, held it to the light, turned it, examined the angle of its twist, then, with absolutely no warning, handed it to me. "For your journey," he said, as if that explained everything. I looked down at the vine. It was just a little loop, about the size of a bracelet, its edges browned slightly where the sun had dried it. I turned it in my hands and said thank you. He sat again, finally kicking off the offending shoe entirely. "There," he said with relief. "Now the foot can think clearly." I didn't question it. Instead, I tucked the vine into my satchel. It joined a growing collection of little oddities I'd picked up along the way. A smooth stone from the edge of a river in 1736, a wooden button carved in a cottage in 1904, a piece of string someone once said had belonged to a pirate, though I was fairly certain it was just string. Leonardo began sketching again. This time the drawing looked suspiciously like a grape with legs. "I think it might walk when no one's watching," he muttered. I offered him a sugar cube I'd forgotten was in my pocket. He accepted it solemnly, crunched it between his teeth and sighed like a man briefly at peace. The sunlight shifted slightly. A cloud, maybe, or just time tilting forward the way it always does. And for a long while, we said nothing. A pigeon landed on the far edge of the fountain and tilted its head at us, first with one eye, then the other. Leonardo looked up from his spirals and regarded the bird with the quiet intensity of someone preparing to ask it a deeply personal question. He didn't, of course, at least not aloud. Instead, he took a sip from his cup and murmured, "If only they could speak." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure whether he was referring to pigeons in general or that one in particular. "They do speak," I offered eventually, "just not in ways we always understand." Leonardo smiled, barely. "Yes, like most good ideas." The pigeon fluffed its feathers, walked in a half circle, and then flew off without so much as a goodbye, which, if I'm honest, was a little rude considering how long it had been staring. Leonardo returned his attention to his page. His spirals had evolved again. Now they resembled clouds, but with ladders inside. He didn't explain them, and I didn't ask. There's a point in every conversation with Leonardo where questions only make things more confusing. It was about then that the breeze shifted, warmer now, heavier, the kind that carries the promise of either late afternoon or a nap, or both. The cat agreed. It had slunk over to my side of the table and curled into a new spot directly beneath my chair. I dared not move my feet. Leonardo absent-mindedly reached into his sleeve and pulled out what appeared to be a stone, smooth, palm-sized, the kind you might skip across a lake or keep in your pocket for years without knowing why. He held it up to the light, examining it like a gem dealer or a philosopher, which, depending on the day, he might have been. "I found this in the river last spring," he said. "It was stuck between two stones who hadn't spoken in years." I didn't laugh. It didn't feel like a joke. He handed it to me. It was heavier than it looked, and surprisingly warm. I turned it over in my palm, watching the way the light slipped across its surface. No shimmer, no markings, just presence. I didn't ask what it meant. I just held on to it. Leonardo sat back, hands folded in his lap, and said nothing more for a long stretch. The fountain behind us gurgled on softly, and somewhere in the vines above, a bee buzzed sleepily from leaf to leaf, considering the nature of pollen. I looked at the stone again. There were, I noticed, faint grooves, like it had been smoothed by centuries of water and hands and waiting. Maybe it meant something, maybe it didn't. That was the thing about Leonardo. He could hand you a pebble, and suddenly it was the key to the universe. Or it was just a pebble. You never really knew. Eventually, I set the stone on the table between us. Leonardo looked at it once more, gave a small approving hum, and resumed sketching. This time it looked like a flying pigeon wearing boots. Leonardo asked me, very quietly, if I could hear the ticking. I paused mid-sip and listened. The courtyard was hushed, fig leaves rustling, the soft burble of the fountain, the distant flap of pigeon wings, but no ticking. Not a clock, not a watch, not even the kettle, which had fully surrendered to silence. I shook my head. No ticking. He furrowed his brow. Not in frustration, but in something more curious. the way someone might frown at a puzzle with one piece just slightly out of reach. "I was sure," he said, looking past me, as if the sound might be hiding behind my shoulder. I turned, just to be polite. Nothing there, of course. Still, Leonardo rose from his chair, the flap of his unshod left foot now a familiar rhythm, and disappeared once again behind the curtain. The room beyond clattered in protest. I remained at the table, the stone still resting quietly in my pocket. It had warmed just slightly, like it knew I'd checked. The cat had curled into a tighter ball, possibly dreaming of chasing slow insects, or maybe just more naps. Leonardo returned, carrying, well, I wasn't sure. It looked a little like a clock, but only if a clock had forgotten how to be a clock and decided instead to be a sculpture of a clock remembering time. There were gears, yes, and a face. But the face was painted. The gears didn't connect, and there was no mechanism to power it. It simply was. He set it on the table with a reverence normally reserved for ancient scrolls or particularly ripe cheese. "This," he said, "is the quietest clock I've never built." I waited. He tapped the side of it gently. No sound. "It only ticks when no one's listening," he added. I nodded. That seemed about right. He then leaned forward and whispered to it. I don't know what he said, but he sat back, satisfied, and for the briefest moment I thought I heard it. Just a single tick, like the pop of a bubble in the distance. Leonardo smiled like a man who had proven a point only he understood. "I keep time," he said, "so I can ignore it." That one stuck with me. We forget sometimes that even clocks can be polite. They can wait. They can go unnoticed if you let them. I looked again at the knot clock. It really was quite beautiful. Not in its function, but in its willingness not to function. A reminder, I suppose, that not everything has to work the way we expect. Leonardo resumed sketching. This time it was a turtle with a sundial on its back. He didn't explain it, and I didn't ask. It must have been getting late, though I hadn't checked the sky. The light had taken on that golden sideways hue, the one that makes everything feel like a painting you're about to step into, or maybe already have. Shadows stretched longer. The fountain gurgled slower. Even the air seemed to pause more between breaths. Leonardo leaned back in his chair and declared, with no warning at all, "I once tried to invent a teacup that could cause an eclipse." I waited, as I had learned to do. He continued. It was supposed to use mirrors, of course, and steam, and a very clever timing device that unfortunately kept exploding. I nodded, as if this were the most reasonable problem to encounter with an eclipsed teacup. "I think," he added after a pause, "that I may have asked it to do too much." He looked down into his cup, empty now, and turned it slowly in his hands. "It never blocked out the sun, but it did once blind a squirrel." He said this with genuine remorse. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I just made a quiet noise of sympathy and handed him what little tea I had left in mine. He accepted it with a nod, poured it back into his own, and gave it a small swirl. "Maybe the trick," he said almost to himself, "is not in eclipsing the sun, but in making the tea feel more important than the sun." He sipped, which this cup is not doing. A breeze nudged the grapevines again. One particularly lazy leaf tumbled down and landed in the middle of the table. It twitched a little, then settled like it had finally found its seat at the conversation. Leonardo stared at it for a while, then carefully scooted his cup beside it as if introducing them. "This is my leaf," he said to no one in particular. "His name is Alfonso." I said hello to Alfonso. Leonardo appeared satisfied. The stone in my pocket gave a tiny thrum. Not a glow yet, but a kind of awareness, like it had turned its attention quietly toward me. I left it alone. It always let me know when it was time. Leonardo reached into his robe once more and pulled out a piece of parchment. It was singed. He handed it to me. A sketch of the original teacup eclipse mechanism, he explained. The drawing was ambitious. It had gears and levers, and what looked like a tiny chair with a crank beside it. One corner was scorched, another corner had a suspicious tea stain, and the top bore the title, Sunblocker Prototype 3.5. I told him it was magnificent. He smiled, not proudly, but like someone who knows their failures are, at the very least, original. He patted the table once, turned his cup again, and whispered to Alfonso that everything was going rather well. And somehow, I agreed. Leonardo was mid-sentence about steam turbines when he stopped suddenly, raised one finger and said, "But of course, that only works if the bird isn't real." I blinked slowly. He nodded as if that clarified everything, then leaned back and looked up at the sky. It had turned a soft, faded gold. The kind of sky that makes you feel like you're in a memory, even while you're still inside it. "The problem," he continued after a long pause, "is that real birds don't like hats. Or perhaps it's not the hats, but the concept of hats. You see, they mistrust anything that perches where they would otherwise like to perch." He paused, looking thoughtful, which, now that I say it aloud, is entirely reasonable. I nodded politely, hoping he would eventually find his way back to the steam turbines. Instead, he sighed and turned to the kettle. "Tea," he said, "is a very patient beverage. I once left a pot steeping for 3 days. Forgot about it completely. When I remembered, it had grown a thin layer of something I named tea bloom. Very floral. Somewhat alarming." He sipped from his now empty cup anyway and looked disappointed, but only mildly. Then, just as suddenly, he returned to the earlier topic as if there had been no detour at all. "Turbines don't need birds, obviously, but I thought it might be a nice touch. A bird that flaps to power the steam. Something poetic about it." He glanced at me, squinting thoughtfully. "Would you rather be powered by feathers or fire?" I gave it a moment. "Feathers, I think." He smiled wide, like that answer confirmed a long-held suspicion. "Good. Fire is temperamental. Feathers at least apologize when they fall apart." The leaf he'd named Alfonso had not moved. Leonardo reached over and gave it a small nudge with one fingertip. "He agrees." I wasn't sure how to follow that. The stone in my pocket stayed cool, quiet as always, though I had the distinct impression it was listening. Leonardo stood suddenly, walked a few steps, then turned on his heel and came back. "Do you think chairs remember who sat in them?" I considered it. "I hope not. I've slouched in quite a few." He laughed, a quiet, surprised kind of laugh, and sat back down. "Then this one is now wiser than it was." And with that, he picked up Alfonso and tucked him gently inside his sketchbook like a page marker. The sun had lowered to that soft, sleepy line just above the courtyard wall. Everything looked dipped in honey. Warm, golden, slightly sticky in a way that made you not want to move too quickly through it. Leonardo was quiet for a long while. He sat with his fingers resting on the table, just barely touching the edge of his sketchbook, where Alfonso, the leaf, now poked out like a slightly crumpled bookmark. Then he blinked and said, "I once tried to invent a compass that pointed toward inspiration instead of north." I turned toward him, intrigued. "It didn't work," he continued, "but it did always point toward the kitchen, which I thought was meaningful." I asked how it worked. He reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a teaspoon. It looked ordinary, a little worn, a little bent at the handle, but he held it like it was the key to something ancient. "This," he said, "was the needle." He set it on the table gently, then reached into another pocket and retrieved a saucer, It had a small divot in the center, with lines etched into it, not in a pattern I recognized, but they had the feeling of meaning. The kind of markings you don't dare wipe off, even if they look like crumbs. He placed the spoon in the saucer and gave it a slow spin. It circled once, twice, then stopped, pointing squarely at the teapot. See? I squinted. So, inspiration is tea? Leonardo grinned. Always. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if confessing something profound. It once pointed toward a candle, though. That was the day I invented the fish lantern. I opened my mouth. No follow-up questions, he said quickly. I closed my mouth. He reclined again, fingers tapping the side of the saucer. I think we all have compasses like this, he said after a moment. But most of them are stuck pointing at should instead of want. That one landed. I looked down at the teaspoon. It hadn't moved. Still pointed at the pot, which now held only memories of warmth. Leonardo hummed to himself, flipping through pages in his sketchbook. I once had a dream, he muttered, that I was a kettle, but only half full, and every time I tried to whistle, someone added a sock. He didn't elaborate. The cat shifted beneath my chair, letting out a long sigh that might have meant same. Leonardo traced a finger along the spiral of one of his earlier drawings. Do you think time has a favorite direction? He asked. I tilted my head. I think maybe sideways. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. Yes. Not forward, not backward, just a gentle lean. He looked again at the spoon in the saucer, still pointing at the pot. Inspiration, indeed. I touched the smooth stone in my pocket with one thumb. It wasn't humming yet, but I had a feeling it would, soon. Just a little longer here. Leonardo tapped the teaspoon once more, gave it a slight spin, and then leaned back with a satisfied sigh as it once again pointed faithfully toward the empty teapot. Still inspired, he declared. The courtyard was quieter now, somehow. The sun had lowered behind the wall, and the light was beginning to thin out. Less gold now. More something between lavender and toast. Leonardo looked up at the sky. Do you ever notice, he said, how the sky never really turns dark? It just becomes more of itself. I tilted my head. It turns more sky, he added, as if that cleared it up. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, he stood again, his left foot still shoeless. He'd never put the flap shoe back on. And he wandered over to the fountain. He dipped a hand in the water, flicked a few drops into the air, and watched them fall. Water forgets everything, he said, glancing back at me. Except music. He made a few more splashes. People think birds sing about love or territory or danger, he continued, but I think they sing about gravity, little reminders that the sky is still there, that it's safe to fall upward if you do it gently enough. He walked back slowly, sat down, and this time he was holding something. A rock. Not a particularly notable rock, just smooth, palm-sized, the kind you might use to hold down papers or prop open a door. He placed it next to the spoon compass. This is my memory rock, he said. I forget why. He chuckled quietly at himself, and then turned to look at the fountain. I once tried to teach a fish to whistle, he said very seriously. I waited. It did not go well. He reached for his sketchbook and flipped past Alfonso the leaf, which had now bent at one corner and was gently resting in a curve. Leonardo pulled a stub of charcoal from somewhere deep in his sleeve and began to draw. I could hear the soft scritch of it on the paper. After a minute, he showed me the page. It was a picture of the travel stone, the spoon, the teacup, the fountain, and, inexplicably, a very round bird wearing goggles. I raised my eyebrows slightly. "It's called the components of clarity," he explained. I nodded solemnly. The bird had a good expression. Wise, maybe, or confused in a very intelligent way. Leonardo tucked the sketch into the back of his book. The cat was now snoring beneath my feet. Not loudly, but with enough rhythm that it felt like it was participating in the conversation. A wind passed through again, softer than before. It didn't rustle so much as it brushed, like a feather across a cheek. Leonardo sat still for a long time, eyes closed, and then he said, "I once sat perfectly still for 11 hours, just to see if the world would move around me." I asked if it did. "Oh, yes," he replied, but it was very polite about it. I shifted slightly, feeling the familiar weight of the stone in my pocket. Still nothing. Just there, quietly waiting, always knowing. Leonardo smiled faintly at something the cat did, or maybe didn't do, and resumed sketching. He didn't look up again, and we sat there, not exactly doing anything, but also not quite doing nothing, just existing. By now, the light in the courtyard had faded into that in-between blue. Not quite night, not quite day's end. The kind of color that feels like a yawn stretched across the sky. Leonardo had stopped drawing. His sketchbook lay open on the table, the pages fluttering a little in the breeze like they were unsure whether to turn themselves or wait for a prompt. The travel stone rested quietly in my pocket. It hadn't hummed yet, but I could tell it was paying attention. It always knew before I did. Leonardo was studying a line on the page, not with the intensity of invention, but with the gentle curiosity of someone watching a cloud become something else. He tapped the page once with the charcoal stub. "Do you see that?" I leaned forward. There was a single spiral on the paper. Simple, loose, wobbly even. "I didn't draw that," he said, eyes still on it. I tilted my head. "You're holding the charcoal." "Yes," he agreed, "but I don't remember moving it." We both stared. "Maybe the page wanted something on it," he offered. That felt right. He leaned back slowly and placed the charcoal down beside the spoon compass. The cat, still beneath my chair, gave a sleepy sneeze, then resumed purring. "Sometimes," Leonardo whispered, "the best thing to make is nothing at all. Then, after a pause, unless it's soup, nothing is a terrible soup." We sat a while longer, saying little. The kind of silence that doesn't press down but instead wraps around you, like a blanket worn thin from stories. The air had cooled, and a few early stars blinked through the canopy overhead. Leonardo looked up. "Do you think stars have schedules?" I shook my head slowly. "Probably not. I imagine they just show up when they feel like it." He smiled, pleased. "I like that. Punctuality is fine, but presence is better." A tiny moth landed on the edge of the table. Leonardo watched it for a long moment, then whispered something I couldn't quite hear. It fluttered away, quite possibly confused. I stood at last, the wooden chair creaking beneath me. Leonardo remained seated, sketchbook open, hand resting on the page where the spiral had appeared. I gently touched the smooth stone in my pocket, and in that moment, it pulsed, soft, warm, a quiet hum like something far away, calling just a little closer. I knew that feeling. It meant time, or something that behaves like time, was nudging me forward. Leonardo looked at me one last time and said, "If you come back, bring a nap." I told him I would. He nodded once, gently. And as I turned, the courtyard faded behind me, just like the dream of something you almost remember having. I turned the stone over in my hand as I wandered slowly through the narrow stone archway leading out of Leonardo's courtyard. It didn't hum, or glow, or pulse. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. It was just quiet. And somehow, that was more powerful than if it had been anything else. Behind me, I heard Leonardo's charcoal begin to scratch once more, no doubt sketching something like the idea of a nap or a chair that dreams when no one's sitting in it. I stepped out into the evening street, if you could call it that. More of a suggestion of a path, the stones uneven and soft with moss. A lantern flickered somewhere nearby, though I never saw who lit it. The stone grew warmer in my palm, or maybe the cool of the night just made it feel that way. I passed a small shop with no sign. Inside, a woman was painting feathers onto spoons. She didn't look up. I kept walking. Everything had that slightly surreal softness to it, as if the world had remembered it was allowed to be still for a while. The stone tugged lightly in my hand. Not literally, of course, just directionally, like a memory you'd forgotten you wanted to return to. And I let it lead me, back through time, or maybe forward, or maybe sideways, past a shutter that creaked like an old man laughing, past a fountain that burbled in a dialect only birds understand, past a child drawing circles on a wall with a stick dipped in honey. And with every step, I felt myself slipping further from the world of clocks and ticking and towards something softer, something sleepier, something that felt like a library where the books read themselves quietly into the night. I looked up once more. A single star blinked, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. And I thought to myself, yes, maybe just one more boring adventure. After all, there are so many stories left to almost remember.